Good evening, everyone. Before I start, I want to tell you that next academic year, we will start a Hebrew Bible discussion group, which is a reading group or a book club that reads the Bible. So if you'll find what we do here today interesting and would like to read and discuss the Hebrew Bible in a group setting, according to the methods I outlined today, then please email me and tell me to put you on the roster. I want to cap the group at 12, so if you want to claim your spot for September, please let me know. So today we'll discuss, our focus will be on the Torah, or the Pentateuch. These are the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. So these 5 books comprise 3 sections. First, an introduction. This is the first 11 chapters of Genesis, up to when we're introduced to Abraham. Second is the main body, covering the birth of Abraham to the death of Moses. And then an afterword, which is the fifth book of the Torah. It's called Dvarim or Deuteronomy, which is about 25% of the Torah. This last book is Moses delivering an oration, a goodbye speech to his people, summing up his and their journey as they prepare to enter their promised land. Now, let me give you a super duper brief history of the Jews, just so that we can have some context about the writing of this book. The first time Jews or Israelites show up on the historian's radar is the end of the 13th century BC, in 1207 BC. What we have from then is a song of praise left by an Egyptian pharaoh named Merneptah for himself, celebrating his victory over the Israelites in what we call Canaan, or the land of Israel. And here, let me get on the map. Okay, so we're talking, this is Egypt, of course, and he's describing a victory somewhere here over people that he calls the Israelites. Obviously, this is a contemporary map, not an ancient map. So this document left by the pharaoh Merneptah is the only non-biblical historical source that mentions Israelites or Jews before the time of King David, which is roughly 1000 BC. Okay, so there are debates as to where these people came from, whether they're foreign or it doesn't matter. What we know for sure is that Israelites had come to Canaan from wherever they came from before 1207 BC. And during or after this period, various Israelite tribes settled in their respective territories, clashing and intermarrying with local peoples of Canaans. Around 1000 BC, the Israelites formed a monarchy to help them resist the Philistines, who were either ruling them or taxing them. So the Israelites had King Saul, the first Israelite king, then David, then Solomon. And after Solomon, at about 926 BC, the Israelite kingdom suffered a civil war and split in 2. A large northern kingdom of Israel, comprising this territory, containing 9 tribes, and then a southern kingdom of Judea, or Judah, which was the smaller or lesser kingdom. So the 2 kingdoms split apart in 926 BC. Then about 200 years later, in 722, the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, was conquered by the Assyrian Empire in what is modern-day Iraq. The Assyrians sent the Israelites east somewhere into exile, and this is the point in which these 9 northern tribes, or 10 northern tribes, I think 9, became lost. Okay, these Israelite tribes disappear from history. These are the lost tribes of Israel. And from now on, the only tribes that are left are the ones, the 2.5 tribes in Judea. Okay, which means that all the Jews on earth today are descended from that southern kingdom of Judah, or Judea. Okay? In fact, the word Jew is comes from Judah. Okay, in Hebrew and all world languages, except for French and English, the word for Jew is Judean. Okay, so just like a Russian is a person from Russia, Serbia is a person from Serbia, American is from America. When you say Jew in all languages other than French and English, what you're saying is Judean, somebody from Judea. Okay, Yehudi, Yehudi, Judayo, Jude, Jud, Judu, all of them. So as you can see, you're saying the word Judean. French and English are anomalies. So So it's at this point that you can start referring to these people as Jews rather than Israelites, because from now on we're dealing only with Judeans and their descendants. Then, about 150 years after that, the Babylonian Empire conquered this kingdom of Judea. They destroy the Jewish temple. They exile a large part of the Judean population eastward to Babylonia. But 50 years later, the Babylonian Empire falls to the Persian Empire, and the Persians allow a massive return of Jews from Mesopotamia, from Iraq, back to Judea. Okay, so the Jews come back, they reestablish a political presence as clients of Persia, of the Persian king, and they rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Okay, and this kicks off what's called the era of the Second Temple, which lasts through the Greek period when Alexander the Great conquers this whole region, and into the Roman period. And during this Greek period, during this period that we're talking about, the Second Temple, in 167 BC, the Jews rebel against their Greek overlords, and they succeed, and they establish an independent kingdom. This is the Maccabee revolt, the story of Hanukkah that you hopefully are familiar with. Later on, the Romans, when the Romans conquer the entire region, about 100 years later in 63 BC, Judea becomes a client kingdom of Rome, and later on it would become a province. Okay? So that's where we'll end the history lesson, except for a brief explanation about how the Israelites differed from their various neighbors in the ancient Near East. And they differed in 2 main respects. First, in having a religion that focused on a single deity, a single God, that was never born and will never die. An abstract God who is not of this world, is not subject to the laws of the universe, but who has a special affinity and connection to the Jewish people. And to this, there was no precedent in the ancient world. A national God, a God that has a nation that is his nation, his people. That's one. The second factor that distinguished Israelites from other peoples of their era was a particularly well-developed historical consciousness. or what we today would probably call a national consciousness or a sense of nationhood. Okay? So a recognition of the importance of a communal past for the survival of the group in the present and the future, and a strong connection of the group to its shared religion, its shared language, and its shared land. Okay, so all of these are elements of modern nationalism or nationhood in our own societies today. Okay, and it's these two factors, the Jews' monotheism and their nationalism, that are probably responsible for the fact that Jews, or that the Jewish people survived as a people for the past 3,000 years, while other peoples of the ancient world have disappeared as political or ethnic entities. Okay, so much for the Jews. Now, a brief word about the book. So the traditional Jewish understanding of the Bible is that the Torah, again, the first 5 books, the 5 books of Moses, the Torah was written by God, either directly or dictated by God to Moses. The other books of the Bible, there's no clear Jewish verdict as to who wrote them and where and when. My sense, my impression, is that the Jewish tradition understands the rest of the Bible as written by human authors in various times and places. Inspired by God, of course, but they're human creations at different times and places. But the Torah, there's no doubt and no speculation. The Torah was written by God. So this means that when religious readers found inconsistencies, or when ancient readers who were religious, when they found inconsistencies or contradictions or other mystifying problems in the text of the Torah, again, those first 5 books, they assumed that the text was fine, okay, but that they were having a hard time understanding God's writing, its logic or purpose or structure. Okay. So when they found problems with the text, their solution was to try harder to understand the author. Okay, they assumed that the text was doing, that the author did a good job, and simply they were having a hard time deciphering what the author was trying to do. That is, that method of reading is literary analysis. Okay? Trying to get into the author's mind, trying to understand the author, the author's mind, the author's purpose, by studying his words and sentences. The phrasing, the syntax, sequencing, literary allusions, literary structures, repeating motifs, etc. So this was how Jews approached the Torah for 3,000, 2,500 years or so. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, biblical scholars developed a new understanding of the Torah, which is called the fragmentary hypothesis or documentary hypothesis. And this hypothesis is a big building block in what's called biblical criticism, which is a field that it's a method of reading, a new method that was developed in the modern era, 18th, 19th century, that applies scientific methods to the study of the Bible. So these scholars who founded biblical criticism and developed the documentary hypothesis started from the same problems and inconsistencies and contradictions in the text that religious readers have been dealing with for the past 2,000 years. But these modern scholars, again, those who developed the documentary hypothesis, they explained that that it's not that we have a problem in understanding the author, but that the text really is inherently inconsistent and contradictory. And this is because the Torah is not really a single literary work written by an author, but is actually a mashup of different stories written by different authors at different times with different styles and for different purposes. To these scholars, the text is in fact a bunch of separate documents, hence the documentary hypothesis. So the text is in fact separate documents that were later on stitched together. Okay, so these are different stories, different remnants from previous works, and these different documents or different sources were stitched together into the text that we now have. And sometimes the text, the stitching is clumsy, is more easily visible. Okay? And therefore, inconsistencies, contradictions, digressions, repetitions, changes in verbiage, and in composition, these are all evidence of the works of different authors that were edited together in this book, or in these 5 books. To the adherents of the documentary or fragmentary hypothesis, these different fragments that make up the Torah reflect the different religious traditions and different theological beliefs and different political purposes of different groups within Israelite society. So, so this method of reading the Bible is not literary analysis, but source analysis. What they're not trying to understand the author's mind and purpose. You know, what's the author trying to do by contradicting himself here? Or what's the author trying to do by telling this story twice and saying X here, but Y there? Or using this uncommon word or phrase. Okay? Instead, what these scholars try to do is to identify the different sources that make up the text. Okay, so it says X here, but Y there, because these are different texts, different sources that were stitched together by some later editor. Okay, so it uses this word here, but a different term over there, simply because this is author A and that is author B. And they both, each has their own style or their own vocabulary reflecting where and when they were writing. So, so you can see here that the documentary hypothesis starts, again, given that it approaches the Bible scientifically, it starts with the assumption that the Torah is a human creation. Therefore, if something does not make sense, like the 2 conflicting creation story that you've read for today, it's explained as evidence of human error. In this case, an editor's clumsy editing. Now, before we go on, I need to offer a brief caveat. So those of you who are versed in biblical criticism will notice that I will sometimes use documentary hypothesis as a catch-all phrase for various biblical criticism explanations for how the biblical text took form. Okay, so I can defend my loose usage in the Q&A, but basically all these explanations that come under the kind of umbrella of biblical criticism or so all of them share, and they all these explanations for how the text came to be insist that different authors at different times and places wrote up different versions of a given story, and these different versions were later edited together. Okay, so the documentary hypothesis has the editing happening one way, other explanations have it another way, but they all insist that the text is not a text written by a single author, but a composite of different sources written by different authors, different times, reflecting different agendas. Okay, so the documentary hypothesis invites the reader to find contradictions and inconsistencies in the ancient text and to solve them through scholarly means. For example, using philology or history to identify the Torah's different authors, their eras, their geographical locations, and to speculate as to when and why these different writings were stitched together. Okay. This method of reading the Bible shines a light on the shortcomings of the biblical editors from, let's say, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, and shines a light on the expertise and perceptiveness of the biblical scholar from today. Okay. By contrast, the traditional religious understanding or method of reading understanding the Torah as a divine creation starts with the assumption that the text does not contain contradictions or inconsistencies. Okay. If some portions seem inconsistent or contradictory or senseless to the human reader, that is because he or she cannot comprehend the text's meaning or the author's purpose or method. Okay. So this method, the traditional method of understanding the Torah and reading the Torah, invites the reader to find shortcomings in his or her own comprehension rather than in the author, because the author is God. So this method of reading the Bible naturally takes for granted that the author is wise and skilled and sophisticated, and that the human reader might have problems in understanding the author's wisdom and meaning of the divine wisdom and meaning of the text. Okay? Just like when you read high literature, you have to work harder to understand what the author is trying to do here with the various literary techniques that he or she deploys. So what I'm saying is that religious readers throughout history have read the Torah as a literary work. They use literary analysis, whereas the documentary hypothesis offers us source analysis. Okay? Now, this is not to say that literary analysis is for religious people and the documentary analysis is for secular people. That's simply not true. Some secular biblical scholars embrace the documentary hypothesis, but other secular scholars reject it. By the same token, many religious Jews and Christians embrace the documentary hypothesis. They're not Orthodox Jews and Christians, but they do claim religious faith and they uphold the documentary hypothesis. Okay? So the point is that rejecting the documentary hypothesis does not mean that you're calling for a literal or fundamentalist reading of the Bible. Rejecting the documentary hypothesis does not mean that you insist God wrote the Torah, or that every word there is true. Okay? So whether the Torah was written by God or written by man is a different debate. Whether the Bible is truth or fiction is a different debate. Okay? This debate over the documentary hypothesis is not whether the Torah is true, but whether the Torah is a book, a single unitary work of literature written by a skilled and purposeful author. So the documentary hypothesis tells us that the Torah is not a book, but in fact a scrapbook, a collection of bits and pieces from other works of literature glued together here. Now, there are various problems that critics of the documentary hypothesis identify with it. But the root problem they point to is that the documentary hypothesis assumes that inconsistencies and contradictions and repetitions and changing patterns or styles in the writing cannot be there by design. Okay? And I'll quote one biblical scholar who, in explaining the merits of the documentary hypothesis, says this outright. He says, quote, "No good modern author will repeat herself or himself nearly so often as does the Torah." And it is true that in various stories in the Torah, we get repeat retellings of certain details. Just for example, we're told twice in the Noah story how many animals and which kinds Noah brought into the ark. And there are differences in the two accounts. But there are two responses to this scholar's charge. First, the most obvious one is that modern authors do, in fact, repeat themselves. Okay? And second, the Bible should not be compared to a modern book or article, but instead it should be compared to a speech. Okay? So let's take the second point first and then move to the first one. The Bible was not written to be read individually, silently as you read a novel or a newspaper. Okay? It was written for an illiterate audience. It was written to be read aloud as a public address. Okay? It was not written to be read, to be consumed through the eyes, but to be heard, kind of like a public lecture, or to experience like a public lecture or a political speech or a sermon. Okay? So it's true that we don't usually, as readers, see much repetition in a single book or article. But when we're a listening audience at a political rally or sitting in the pews listening to a sermon or listening to family folklore at a family reunion, how often have you heard elements of a story repeated or restated? It's actually quite common and quite necessary. Okay? Because an audience of readers can reread difficult parts or thought-provoking parts. Okay? But an audience of listeners cannot do that. Listeners can't re-listen to something that they had a hard time understanding, or something that triggered some sort of recognition in them. So if you want the crowd, to the audience of listeners, to contemplate something, or to notice something, or to remember something for later, or to comprehend something really important, you have to retell that part to them. They cannot reread it, so you have to retell it. You have to retell it, just like I now did, because that's important. So repetition is not evidence for the documentary hypothesis. Repetition is evidence that the biblical scholars who came up with the documentary hypothesis are trapped in their own modern experience of the Bible, in their experience as readers of a book that you can carry into your room and read leisurely at your desk. A book with pages that you can leaf through and leaf back into. They're studying the Bible as a book instead of studying it as it was written by its authors or author, and as it was experienced by ancient Jews as a speech. Okay, and just as a thought experiment, consider how you'd react if you gave a political speech at a rally and somebody printed it out, bound it in a book cover, and gave it to literary critics or to philosophy professors to review as a book of political philosophy. Or the other way around, even better. If you wrote a political philosophy book and somebody read it out loud to a bunch of political consultants, asking them to grade it as a political rally speech. Okay, so of course your critics would pan your work, but you tell them that they're victims of a hoax. Okay, they've been misled to judge your speech as if it were a book, or judge your book as if it were a speech. Okay, so that's one problem with the documentary hypothesis, that its adherents misconstrue what they're analyzing. They're analyzing a speech as if it's a book. Okay? But let's put that to the side. I mean, it's an important critique, but let's put that to the side and go with their method, with the method of the documentary hypothesis, which has us reading the Bible as a book and judging it as we judge the written word, rather than as we judge the spoken word. Okay, so again, if we compare this book to modern books that we read, I'll go back to that claim. That claim that modern authors would not repeat themselves is simply incorrect. Okay? Modern authors do. We've all read modern works of literature and watched movies like Rashomon, Memento, and Pulp Fiction, in which the same event is retold a number of times, but retold differently to show how different characters perceive them from their own different perspective. Okay? To relate different accounts of the same event. Or the author might retell you the story of how the boy met the girl, so the same story that you read 100 pages ago, to illustrate to you how you now understand that first meeting in a completely different light because of everything you've read or everything you've learned about the characters in the intervening 100 pages. Or a book in which the same story is repeated, but with slight differences in the plot, revealing how one random act can change the course of events and alter the lives of the characters. Now, besides the, so that has to do with repetition, the supposed problem of repetition in the Torah. Now, on top of narrative repetition, other literary patterns that the documentary hypothesis identifies as problems in the Bible are, number one, instances in which one part of the biblical story contradicts or clashes with other parts. Okay? Second, instances in which the biblical author switches from one style of writing to another in the same story. And third, instances in which the biblical author deploys different or uses different word choices in different parts of the same story. And the most famous example of the documentary hypothesists point to for this is when the Torah uses the word God here, but Lord there, and Lord God over there, and God's actual name, JHVA, over there. But again, we've all read modern works of literature in which the author does all three of these things. Okay, number one, setting up scene two, in which something seems to contradict what we read in scene one. Okay, setting up a problem for the reader or the viewer that you have to work out. You have to somehow fill in the blank. Okay, so what happened in between scene one and scene two that makes this contradiction that explains or can help, that'll make sense of this seeming contradiction. Okay? That's the first one. The second, switching from one writing style to another. Again, you've read works of literature that in which the author switches from modern English to archaic English, or from highbrow to lowbrow. You've read poems in which the poet uses a certain word in one verse, but purposefully chooses a loaded synonym for the same concept or the same thing in another verse. And sometimes we use synonyms not to convey some message or meaning, but simply to avoid repeating the same word or phrase over and over. Okay, so if you're writing a diplomatic history, you might say they signed a treaty the first time, but then the second time around, you'll say they struck an alliance. And the third time, you might say they affirmed a covenant. Okay, so these synonyms need not be signs of three different authors, just a sign of an author trying to use some variety in his writing or oratory. And then the third problem is the example I gave about different appellations for God. Okay? So if you, for example, write or tell people about this meeting that we're having now, you will likely call me different. You'll refer to me differently at different times, from one sentence to the next. Okay, so you might call me Dr. Chet here, Chet over there, the professor, Chet, Guy, the speaker. Okay, so you'll vary your appellations for me simply for the sake of variety. Moreover, using different appellations can have a literary purpose beyond mere variety. Okay, just a nice example and a quick one to offer for this is the different appellations we have that the biblical text offers for Ishmael in the Abraham story. Okay? So if you read the text in a close translation of the Hebrew, you'll see that the narrator refers to Ishmael either as Ishmael or as the lad. That's how the narrator refers to him. But when the narrator narrates Hagar, the mother, speaking about Ishmael, he's referred to as the boy, diminutive. Okay. When the narrator narrates Abraham's thoughts or actions about Ishmael, Ishmael is referred to as his son. And when Sarah speaks about Ishmael, he is referred to as the son of Hagar, the Egyptian woman. It is silly to suggest that this is not by design. This is a consistent pattern in the Ishmael story. Okay, so clearly, we have here a thoughtful and subtle author who devised a clever literary technique to plant loaded words to convey to the audience subconsciously messages about the emotional relationships and tensions between the different characters. So when we see inconsistencies and contradictions and repetitions in modern works of literature, what we do is we try to understand the author's intent. Okay, what is this thought? What is this thoughtful author trying to convey to me by contradicting something he told me beforehand in a previous chapter? What is the author trying to convey with this particular word choice or this particular way of retelling a story from earlier in the book? And when we think that we understand the author's intent, we're really impressed with his or her ability to use a literary device to transmit a message or to show us something that we wouldn't otherwise notice or contemplate. But when we see similar inconsistencies and contradictions and repetitions in an ancient work of literature, we're told by the documentary hypothesis to assume the opposite. Assume that the ancient authors could not have been as clever a writer as Alice Munro or Quentin Tarantino or Toni Morrison. And who knows, maybe 3,000, probably 3,000 years from now, literary scholars will look at Tarantino and Morrison and say, look at these repetitions or contradictions or inconsistent phrasing, inconsistent phrases. Their evidence, these inconsistencies and repetitions and digressions, that's evidence that this book or script did not have a single author, but was instead different stories by different authors, different sources that were then pasted together somewhat clumsily. As another short example of seeing a problem with the text and solving it, two different solutions that you can offer for this problem is the story of the binding of Isaac, which you'll find in Genesis 22. I hope everyone knows the story, whether you've read it in the Bible or not. But let me give you a quick rundown. You see the images here, quite graphic. So God tells Abraham to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac, and Abraham dutifully commences to do it. So and of course, those who haven't read, at the very end, an angel of God comes in and tells Abraham that actually there's no need. So in this story, when Abraham and Isaac go and to commit this, to perform this sacrifice, the biblical author tells us that Abraham took the wood, the fire, and the knife and marched up the hill with the boy towards where God told him to sacrifice Isaac. And as they march, the boy asks his father, here is the wood and I'm quoting, here is the wood and the fire, but where's the lamb for the sacrifice? Okay, so what's the problem here? What inconsistency do you find here? I always have a hard time reading the chat because it's so small. So let me read it again. So the author tells us earlier that Abraham took the wood, the fire, and the knife, and then they marched up a hill. And then later on, Isaac asks Abraham, here's the wood and the fire, but where's the lamb for the sacrifice? So what's the problem? Right, bingo from Jim. the author tells us that the father took three things, but the boy lists only two, leaving out the dagger, the knife. So, so that can be simple oversight or error or sloppiness on the author's part. Or it could be a purposeful omission on the author's part. Okay, so it could be by mistake, it could be on purpose. If it's the author's, if what explains the omission of the knife is sloppiness or error on the part of the author, then fine. We don't have to consider it further. We have the answer. This is why the knife is missing. But if it were a modern work of literature by a widely respected author, what would you make of this omission? What would you personally, Jim, or anyone else among you, what would you make, what would you think the author is trying to convey by omitting the knife? Okay, so one, I know some of you aren't, well, might be on your phones and might not see the chat. So one explanation is that Abraham is hiding the knife. Okay, so Isaac doesn't see the knife and therefore just mentions the wood and the fire. Yes, the wood and the fire. What's another explanation? Look, it's true. There are only two possibilities here. Either Isaac doesn't see the knife and therefore doesn't mention it, or he does see the knife and doesn't mention it. Okay. So if he doesn't see, if he didn't see the knife because Abraham was hiding it, obviously Abraham is hiding it because he is feeling terrible about what he's about to do, and he's trying not to distress the son, and so he's hiding the dagger from him. But even if that's true, there's a problem there because look, Isaac by this point in the story is anywhere between the age of 16 and the age of 30 something. He's not a young child. It's not his first sacrifice. And so he knows, because Abraham said in public to the entourage that they were traveling with, that they're going up the hill to offer a sacrifice to God. Isaac knows someone, something is going to be killed with a knife. Okay. So look, it might convey that, it might suggest that Abraham hid the knife, but even without seeing the knife, Isaac would know that there's a knife involved, that we're going to sacrifice something. So what's the, if Isaac did see the knife, what does the omission suggest? Again, how would you understand it if this were a modern work of literature? What's the author trying to convey? Yeah, so look, Isaac is catching on to what is happening. The omission of the knife, of the knife, conveys this kind of turmoil or terror in Isaac. He dare not ask or challenge his father directly, but he begins to suspect what the knife is for. Well, he's maybe suspected, and he's been contemplating it throughout the silent walk up the hill. Okay? He knows there's no lamb to the slaughter. Okay? There's only Abraham and himself. Okay? So when we read that the two continued to walk after this conversation, we have a very different sense of what this walk was like. thanks to that question from Isaac, we know that it's not a walk involving a heavy-hearted father and a clueless, happy-go-lucky boy. It's a tense, silent, dramatic walk involving a man who knows he's about to commit a terrible act, and an increasingly panicked boy whose mind is racing as he contemplates whether his father is about to kill him. Again, going to this question of what kind of author we have here, I urge you to look up this story, specifically this section in Genesis 22, as they walk up the mountain, to see the author's literary technique, skill in building dramatic tension as the two of them go up the hill. You'll read there that, and I'm quoting from the text here, that you'll read there that Abraham loads Isaac, his son, with the wood. And Isaac says to Abraham, his father, whatever he says. And Isaac says, "Father," and the father responds, "Yes, my son." And then Isaac asks him the question that I just told you about the offering. And Abraham says, "God will provide the lamb for the slaughter, my son." Then Abraham binds Isaac, his son. And then Abraham raises his knife to slaughter his son. Okay, so the author batters the readers with this clash between the intimate and the intimate connection between them and the tender way that they speak to one another, and the violence that we know is about to happen. Kind of a clash between Isaac's sweet trust in his, or deference to his father, and the father's silent betrayal of the son. So that's a decision that readers have to make individually before they start reading the Bible. Is it possible that the biblical author was as sophisticated and skilled and creative as our best authors? Is it possible that the Bible's ancient readers or listeners were as perceptive as modern readers and viewers? If the Bible was written by a simple, primitive author, then our job as readers is very different than if the author was wise and sophisticated. And the same goes for the readership. If the Bible was written for dupes and dummies, for a bunch of goat herders who don't know anything and who are simpletons as consumers of literature, then we should read the Bible as we do modern day children's literature. Okay? Children's literature is not written for geniuses. And because of that, we read children's literature from above. Okay? We're here, children are here, and so we're reading accordingly. Okay? If, on the other hand, the Bible was written for people who can think and reason and moralize like us, then we need to read this book differently. And we need to read it respectfully, just like we do modern high literature. So these are two different approaches to history. And I'm not saying which one's right or that one is right and the other is wrong. I'm saying that when you read pre-modern sources or pre-modern literature, you need to know what you think about pre-modern people. Are we smarter and more thoughtful and more decent than they were, or less than they were, or just the same? Okay? And I'm not saying this to be provocative, because there's a real argument to be made that we are smarter than them. Okay? There's a real argument to be made that we're more decent than them. But there's also an argument to be made that we're dumber and more indecent, and an argument that we're roughly the same as they were. But my point is simply that you have to know what you think of them. And of course, you have to be able to explain to yourself and to others what makes you believe what you believe. Okay, so let's put these two methods to use with the two creation stories, and see how the two ways of reading the Bible explain the clashing creation stories. So how source analysis, the documentary hypothesis, explains it, and how literary analysis can explain it. So the two creation stories you've read. So the first one stretches from Genesis 1, verse 1, through to the 4th verse of chapter 2. And then the second creation story comes immediately after, from Genesis 2, verse 5, to roughly the end of chapter 3. So clearly there are significant differences between the two creation stories. And Jewish and Christian theologians have struggled and still struggle to explain these contradictory stories, and so that's what we're going to do here. So you've read the two accounts of creation, and you've identified the differences, and let me just share the screen of all the differences that you and 2,000 years of Jewish and Christian scholars have identified between the two stories. I've compiled them here for you. So I'll give you a minute or two to read the screen, just to get a sense of just how meaningful the difference between the two stories are. You can, of course, keep on reading. I'll leave it up as we discuss it. Now, this example, this episode, the two clashing, contradictory creation stories, are a great example of both approaches, both literary analysis and source analysis, both the traditional reading, literary reading of the Torah, and the documentary hypothesis or biblical criticism. Both approaches thinking that they have a home run for their side here. Okay. So the source critics say that only the fragmentary or documentary hypothesis can explain these two conflicting accounts of creation. They say these are clearly two different stories that were thrown in one after the other, reflecting different religious traditions, different folklores, and even different theologies that were current within Israelite tribes. And when the book was being edited, they couldn't just leave out the creation stories of large parts of Israelite society, and so they just put them both in. Those who reject the documentary hypothesis hold that these two stories indicate the opposite theory, the theory of the single sophisticated author. They point to the documentary hypothesis and say, do you really expect us to believe that the editor of a religious book, of a theological book, which purports to tell its readers something true, would knowingly leave two contradictory stories at the very beginning of the book? No editor who's halfway competent would do that. So are we supposed to believe that the editor didn't care whether readers found his book at all credible? Or are we supposed to believe that the editor thought that readers won't notice the contradiction between the two stories? I mean, we know that readers do notice. You just did. I mean, it's easy. I mean, it's impossible not to notice. And we know, or we assume, that the editor of what, if there's an editor, you have to assume that the editor of one of the great literary and theological works in history was not an incompetent. So even if we accept the idea that this book was edited together from different sources, rather than written by a single author, it stands to reason that this editor clearly thought that there's some sort of message to convey with this weird literary device of pairing two different creation stories. Which means that the documentary hypothesis doesn't solve the problem for us. It just changes the question from what is the author trying to tell us with these two opposing accounts to what is the editor trying to tell us with these two opposing accounts. So let's assume we're dealing with either a skilled author or a skilled editor, or a sophisticated author or a sophisticated editor. Okay? Just as we would if we were reading a current day award-winning book or watching an Oscar-winning movie. So if this were a book or movie, again, a well-respected modern work of literature or cinema that started with two origin stories that contradicted one another. Okay, like, so, the Batman movie. Okay, it starts with how Batman came into being, his childhood, and so if the movie started with two different accounts of Batman's childhood and how he became this unique character, how would you explain it? I'm not rhetorically, I really am asking. Okay, so look, you have two explanations here which fall into the two categories, or two of the three explanations that are most common, or two common, one uncommon. So Heather points out that you can have an outline, that one can be an outline, and then the other fills in details. Okay, and in this case, the standard traditional explanation in Judaism and Christianity is this one. Okay, the chapter 1 is a general story of what happened. Okay, so it tells us that God created plants, animals, humans, the world. And then chapter 2 comes in and tells the story in great detail and all the more sophisticated elements of it. Okay? The problem with this explanation in this case is that it's not simply a general story and then a more detailed story in chapter 2, but rather there's a completely different order of creation. In chapter 1, man is created last, whereas in chapter 2, he's created before the plants and the animals. Okay, so that's not just filling in details, it's a different story altogether. and then the issue of being evicted from the garden or not. Was where Adam and Eve kind of start their life in one place and then kicked out to earth, or to our earth, or did they start off in the world? So these are different stories rather than just filling in details. And there's also the question of why the different styles. Chapter 1 is very lofty, whereas chapter 2 is written very prosaically. And this leads to the second solution that historically has been offered by commentators, that perhaps chapter 1 is poetic, which explains the more lofty literary style, and explains the fact that it rearranges the order of events for dramatic or poetic effect, even if it's not super accurate. Okay? Whereas chapter 2 is the real history, okay? the History Channel version of creation. Okay? So it's prosaic, but it's a more true representation of what happened. Okay? So that perhaps. Perhaps, but if this were a Quentin Tarantino movie, or a movie by Kurosawa, the guy who made Rashomon, or by the guy who made Memento, whoever that was, we would understand the discrepancy between the two stories very differently, not poetic and prosaic, but along the lines of the second explanation offered in the chat here by, I forget who it was, John, maybe. So the classic movie that offers this approach, of different characters offering different narratives of the same event, the classic movie that kind of introduced that approach, I think, to cinema is the movie Rashomon by Kurosawa. It's from the Japanese movie from the 60s. There was an American remake after that called The Outrage, I think with Paul Newman, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, it's a good movie too. And so the story is a story of a rape and murder, but it's told, the same event is told 4 times during the movie, and each time it's told differently by the 4 different witnesses of the event. Okay? And that puts the viewer, and so the viewer is exposed to contradictory accounts of the event, kind of like a juror in the jury box. And you, the viewer, are left to kind of piece together what really happened based on the 4 different stories told. You have to account for the different perspectives and different interests of the different storytellers, different witnesses. So we have modern literary examples of books or movies that tell parallel stories told by different participants. The same story told by different participants or witnesses, reflecting their different perspectives, different interests in relating the story. So a biblical scholar by the name of Pamela Rice, or Reese, argues that these 2 chapters, or 2 creation stories, are exactly that. Okay, they're the same story, the same event, told from 2 perspectives, God's and man's. Okay, so the Bible tells us what happened in chapter 1 as God experienced it. In fact, we even hear God speaking in the first person there with, "Let us make man in our own image." Whereas in chapter 2, the biblical author tells us what happened as Adam experienced it. And if you think of it, if you examine what parts of the creation story stuck with you as a human being, which I'm assuming all of you are, then you'll see that almost all of them, or all of them, are parts from chapter 2. Okay, from the human account or human experience of creation. The story of the Garden of Eden, Adam being created separately, Eve being created from Adam's rib, the serpent, the forbidden fruit, the eviction from the Garden of Eden, the curse that God cursed them. Okay. So if you take a look at the screen at all these differences between chapters 1 and 2, or story 1 and 2, in light of this theory, you can see that in chapter 1, God knows that man is made in his own image. In chapter 2, man does not know this. It's not mentioned. Adam cannot know, how he was created, that he was created in God's image. In chapter 1, God knows what he did before Adam came into being. In Adam's account, in chapter 2, the story of creation begins when he opens his eyes. And only then does he encounter the plants, the animals, later on Eve. In 1, God knows how he created humans out of nothing with his word. But people can't create anything out of nothing supernaturally. So in man's account, in the second creation story, the act of creation is depicted in very human terms. God creates something out of something else. He takes earth and molds it into a man. He takes a rib and molds it into a woman, okay, by hand. So in man's account, God's act of creation are physical acts, not metaphysical acts, as they're presented in God's account in chapter 1. In chapter 1, God does not view human labor and pain and sorrow and death as punishment. Those are the gifts. That is the gift he gave us. Okay? Labor, pain, suffering, death. These are features of the good and proper order of things. Okay? Adam and Eve did not sin, and they were not punished. Man, however, in chapter 2, sees the harsh realities of life, again, work, pain, sorrow, and death, as a curse, as a punishment. In chapter 1, God knows that Adam and Eve were made for one another and made for sex and procreation, for prospering and multiplying, which God tells them to do in chapter 1. But in chapter 2, Adam learns only over time, with age, that the woman is his proper mate, not the animals. And only later, with age, do they discover sex and procreation. In God's account, chapter 1, God knows that he created what he wanted to create, and it was good. In chapter 2, Adam sees various mistakes in God's act of creation, and Adam guides God as to how to fix these errors. Okay? Adam is lonely, so God creates the animals. Adam doesn't find a mate among the animals, so God creates Eve. Okay? And additionally, you might notice that the second account, the second creation story, dwells on physical descriptions of the environment. In chapter 2, verse 10 to 12, it tells of the rivers in the Garden of Eden and the gold and the precious stones. These are not things that God is interested in. They're not mentioned in chapter 1. But these are things that human beings are extremely interested in. It makes an impression. And the stylistic differences between the two accounts convey a similar dichotomy. Chapter 1 is a masterfully structured and lofty literary work with all sorts of repeating patterns and motifs, whereas chapter 2 is a prosaic list of, this happened and this happened and this happened. But to the documentary hypothesis folks, this is proof positive of two different authors, one lofty and poetic, the other not. But that's because they won't allow the possibility that an ancient author could create two different styles to convey a message, a theological or philosophical message in this case, about the nature of God and the nature of man, or about the inability of man to understand God and to understand his proper role in God's world. Okay, so if I wrote this today, literary critics would point out how clever and sophisticated I am. Okay? But 3,000 years from now, literary critics would assume that my paired stories were written by two different authors and just mashed together. Okay? Because readers 3,000 years from now will look down on us the same way that we look down on humans from 3,000 years ago. So you see here, just in this first episode of the Torah, what literary analysis allows us to see in the text versus what source analysis, the documentary hypothesis, tells us about the text. And lest you think I'm being fanciful about the two creation stories, that I'm seeing things that aren't there with perspective, two perspectives at play. You can see this technique elsewhere, where the Bible tells us a story not through the narrator's eyes, but through the eyes of a character in the story. For example, when Jacob fights the angel, or when Saul meets Samuel. We can discuss it in Q&A, but the point is, this is not a one-off here. Okay? This technique of telling a story through the perspective of different characters is evident elsewhere in the Bible. So it's not a technique that was invented in the 20th century. So I'm sure that you can tell that my own approach to the Bible is that of literary analysis rather than source analysis. I don't find the documentary hypothesis credible or reasonable. Plus, I find it dull. Okay, dull, not dumb, dull. It robs this book of its literary artistry and of its wisdom. It paints the author or editor as a ham-fisted and clumsy incompetent, and it paints the Jews who were presented with this book 3,000 years ago as fools who did not notice the crude and disjointed editorial stitching in the text. Yeah. Now, in the 19th century, when the documentary hypothesis became the reigning approach to biblical studies, the same approach was taken up also by classicists, by scholars of Homer. So these classical scholars broke down the Iliad and the Odyssey, finding or purporting to find different sources patched together by some later editor. Okay, so they made the same claim about Homer as they make about the Torah, that it's not really a work of literature, but written by a skilled author using various techniques, but rather a mashup of older sources gathered together. But these theories about Homer have been, over time, left behind as silly. Okay, they're no longer taken seriously by serious people. Yet this approach to the Hebrew Bible, or to the Hebrew Bible, is still very much with us, especially in Israel and the US. But I think in a generation or two, it might become a scholarly relic, just as it has in Homeric studies. And I think this started happening, at least in European universities, about 60 years ago. So perhaps, perhaps scholars from the 1960s, people like Umberto Cassuto and Ivan Engnel, will help younger scholars see the documentary hypothesis as A, kind of boring, and B, as an orthodoxy that increasingly cannot answer various intellectual and this ossified orthodoxy that can't address intellectual and methodological challenges that are posed to it. Thank you. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. So the question is, why can't we do both? Excuse me. Why make us choose? Why can't you use the documentary hypothesis where appropriate and literary analysis where appropriate? So you're right. I don't think that we have a choice. That we can avoid choosing. And the reason is that the documentary hypothesis is interested in the history of the text. Okay? Its approach is historical, not literary. It's interested in who wrote this, when it was written, why it was written. When did the editor, where was this part written? When was it written? Who wrote it? Why did he write it? And when were these different parts stitched together? And why were they stitched together this way? So if that is your approach, then you cannot also read the book as a literary whole, as if it was written by a single, purposeful, and sophisticated author. Okay, you cannot chop up the text and also keep it whole in your mind. Okay, you can't make an egg out of scrambled eggs. Okay, so you wind up having to choose whether you're going to take it seriously as a literary work or whether you're going to break it down as a source for doing history. So, look, there's historians need to do historical work. Excuse me. So we can spend our time doing a historical analysis of these books, focusing on when and where this story was written, how it reflects historical realities from that time and place, where the text matches the archaeology and where the author fudged things for dramatic effect. Or we can just do literary analysis, kind of looking at the characters, looking at how dramatic tension is built, et cetera, et cetera. Both approaches are certainly legitimate, and both are useful for different purposes. But if you focus on one, then you're not focusing on the other. In fact, one precludes the other. Okay, so you need to choose, are we historians and archaeologists, or are we readers? Are we literary readers or analysts? To me, if focusing on what the actual size of David's kingdom was and whether he really turned the tables on the Philistines, and was there Goliath, and was this part of the David story written in the northern kingdom and then repurposed for the purposes of the southern kingdom? If this kind of historical work makes us miss the character of David, makes us miss it's missing the meaning and the moral lessons that the author offers through the literary character of David, then we've cheated ourselves out of the most important and useful and beautiful and impressive part of the story. Okay? So think, forget the Bible, think of Shakespeare. Okay, the historical plays, the play about Julius Caesar or about Richard III. These dramas, these plays, teach you a lesson in Roman history or English history. And it teaches you a lesson on human nature and a lesson on political power and a lesson on honor and character and morality. What would you think of a literature teacher who devotes 90% of the class to examining the historical details of the play against the historical record, clarifying what is history and where Shakespeare took dramatic license, and didn't discuss with the students the character or the character development of the different characters, okay? And the literary means by which the author offers his insights on morals and psychology and political power and civics. Okay? So that teacher would be missing the point of Shakespeare and robbing the students of the true content of Shakespearean literature. Okay, so that teacher might be an excellent history teacher, but a terrible literature teacher. Okay, so elevating textual analysis over literary analysis with the Bible or with Shakespeare. Okay, so breaking Shakespeare down and seeing, it kind of identifying Shakespeare's environment and political environment and how that made him understand Roman history or medieval history. Look, it's like eating the ice cream cone and throwing away the ice cream. Okay, so again, the books of the Bible, the book of Judges. Okay, the book of Judges also tells a historical story about the Israelites. But if you think of it as a history textbook, then you can't differentiate between the essential and the secondary. You can't tell that the point of buying ice cream is the ice cream, not the cone. Okay, the cone, in this case, the history, biblical history, is just a delivery system. Okay, so certainly I'm not knocking history and archaeology. I'm a historian myself. Biblical history and archaeology and philology are not secondary for historians and archaeologists and philologists. Okay, these people need to use the Bible as a historical source because that's their primary task. It's their job to approach the Bible with the tools of biblical criticism, of history, of archaeology, of philology, etc. But most Bible readers are not historians and archaeologists. Okay, we're readers. Okay? Most readers are disinterested in biblical criticism and in the documentary hypothesis. And it's not because we're anti-intellectual or anti-scientific, but because our affection for the Bible or interest in the Bible originated in love for biblical literature and biblical characters, not love for biblical archaeology. Yeah, so the question from Chris is about the merits of the documentary hypothesis. That's like you have all these great scholars who swear by it, and again, they represent the majority position among biblical scholars. So look, what I hope you saw today is that my dog. What I hope you saw is that the circumstantial evidence for the documentary hypothesis can be more easily explained or as easily explained as great writing than clumsy editing. But even if the documentary hypothesis is correct, it still doesn't solve the problem it introduces, because it still leaves us with a literary problem that requires a literary analysis or literary solution. Okay? Why did the skillful editor place two seemingly incompatible creation stories? Why did the skillful editor, again, let's say it's an editor, not, it was cobbled together, let's say. Why did the editor do it this way, in this obvious way? Why put the two creation stories together? Why did the skillful editor refer to God as a plural entity? Why did the skillful editor tell us two very similar stories about Abraham handing over his wife to another man? So how did ancient readers interpret these oddities, and how should we interpret them? Okay, so look, I myself, I don't buy the documentary hypothesis, but look, your question is correct. I'm not a biblical scholar. Okay, I'm just an amateur reader, student of biblical scholarship, or of the Bible and of biblical scholarship. My point is that even if you accept it, even if you accept the documentary hypothesis, you still can't avoid doing literary analysis on this text, unless you're willing to say that the editor or editors were clumsy editors who just, mashed different stories together without any literary purpose or any literary craftsmanship. That they weren't thinking about the literary purpose of this story next to this story, or that this one contradicts this, and why not solve this contradiction or this literary problem? Okay, so you have to, if you have to do this kind of literary analysis, unless you think that the editor was clumsy and clueless, and that generations of ancient audiences were too dim-witted to notice the contradictions and repetitions and the obvious splicing. Okay, so like I don't want to get so sorry. The question is about the other examples of this literary technique of telling the story through somebody else's eyes. So, look, if you go to I don't remember the chapters, but if you read the story of Jacob fighting with the angel of God, you'll see that the text says that he fought with a man. Okay? But later, Jacob and we find out that in fact it was an angel of God. Okay? So the story narrates the story of the fight through Jacob's eyes, reflecting Jacob's understanding that it's just some dude who came and fought him. Okay. So that's the one example, just briefly. A fuller, more explicit example of this technique is in the story of Saul setting out to find his father's donkeys and finding a king's crown instead. I won't go through the whole thing, but when he travels before he meets Samuel, you'll see that everything just kind of is happenstance. Everything happens and works out a certain way. And then on the way from Samuel back home, Samuel tells him everything that's going to happen. And so you see the story before Saul is chosen by God to be king. He thinks that he is in command of, he makes choices, and his story is marked by chance and by his decision making. And afterwards, Samuel tells him all the quote unquote coincidences that will happen to him on his way home. And so in the second half of the story, you can see that Saul understands that God is in charge of kind of bringing him here to this fateful meeting with Samuel and kind of setting all these coincidences in his way to guide him. So the story from Jane, is whether the Bible's, whether the stories of the Bible are true. So look, I was once told by, I attended a talk here at UNT by an Israeli philosopher about something to do with the Bible. I forget the topic now. And in the Q&A, an audience member asked this question, and I should mention the speaker, the philosopher guy, was a religious man himself, wearing a yarmulke. So the person from the audience asked him if he believed that the Bible was true or accurate. To which the guy responded by saying that it depends on what true or accurate mean. For example, if I complained, if I wrote a letter to John Grisham saying that, hey, I read your book about, this thriller about Washington, D.C., and I went there to find this restaurant or this law office mentioned in your book, and it doesn't exist. What gives? His response would be, look, this is a novel. It's not a reference book for things in the real world. Its purpose is to entertain or to tell you something about Washington, something true about Washington, D.C., but not the location of restaurants, but the nature of corruption or ambition or whatever else. Similarly, if I complained to the Yellow Pages that that your book is really boring, and I can't get through it, I should, to a younger audience, I should point out that the Yellow Pages is the name of a phone book from the days of yore. I should probably also explain that a phone book is a book in which everyone's phone numbers were once listed alphabetically. So if I complain to the Yellow Pages that your book is really boring, just number after number, I can't get through it, they'd say, look, this is not a book for entertainment, to entertain you as a reader. It's a database. Okay? And so the speaker's point was that the Bible should be judged according to what it is, not what it's not. And to him, The Bible is not a history book or a geology book or a biology book, right, like a textbook. Rather, the Bible is a book for Jews about their relationship with God. Okay? It explains to them the nature of this relationship and the nature of their God. Okay? In particular, the fact that he is a just God who created a world governed by divine justice. Okay? So, no, so I'm assuming the question that you're asking is, should we believe that the snake literally spoke to Eve, or that, other things like that? Look, some people dismiss the Bible as silly and useless because books that feature talking snakes are appropriate as children's literature, but should not be read seriously by serious-minded adults. And the people who make this observation, I think they truly think that nobody before them has noticed that the Bible is full of fantastical things that cannot be true in the real world. Okay, so Jewish and Christian theologians noticed 2,000 years ago that that Genesis 1 through 11 are different from the rest of the Torah and from the rest of the Bible generally. Okay, in chapters 1 through 11, people live for hundreds and hundreds of years, up to 900 or more. There are stories about sons of God who marry earth girls and produce giants. There's a flood that drowns out the whole world. There's a tower that reaches the heavens, talking snakes. Okay, but from Genesis 12 on, okay, from the point we're introduced to Abraham, the biblical story takes place in a world that is quite recognizable to us. Okay, people die at normal age. There are no monsters, no world-destroying floods, no talking animals. Now, occasionally there are miracles, okay, including this one miracle where God makes a donkey speak, but that's clearly a miracle. Okay? The Bible clarifies that God made the mule donkey speak and that it's supernatural. Okay? Its value is in what a crazy thing it is. Okay? By contrast, in chapters 1 through 11, or specifically the snake in the garden, speaking to Eve, the snake in there speaks to Eve naturally, and nobody comments on it as fantastical. Okay, not the biblical author, and not Eve. Nobody's surprised by this crazy thing, like everyone is surprised by the talking donkey. Okay, later on. And the author doesn't even feel the need to explain how the snake lost the power of speech. Okay, it's not one of the curses that God put on the serpent for corrupting Adam and Eve. So wise people in the past understood that these chapters in Genesis 1 through 11 are not historical in the way that Abraham or Moses or Joshua or David, that those stories are historical. Rather than their function is different. So those ancient readers tried to understand what is the function of these chapters as opposed to the rest of the Torah. Okay, so are these chapters symbolic or allegorical, or is it a literary device to transmit truths about God or the universe or whatever it is? Okay. So instead of acting, no offense, a bit like teenagers who think that we see and understand things that no one has seen before, I think these people who notice these crazy things about the Bible should study the people, the commentators who've noticed these things 100 years before, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and how they explained it, and try to learn from wise readers in the past who noticed these things and thought about them intelligently, rather than kind of, hey, I discovered something crazy, and that dismisses the whole book. Let me take last question because I think we're going pretty long here. Okay, so there's a question about the Bible as a literary question about how does the Bible compare to other ancient religious works. So in terms of is the Bible consistent with other ancient literary works or other ancient religious works? So ancient mythologies, Greek, Canaanite, Egyptian, Babylonian, consistently focus on the gods' dramas, their challenges, their exploits, miracles they performed, actions they took, their victories and failures, their relationships with other gods, relationships with humans. And from that perspective, the Bible was clearly out of step with this ancient body of religious literature, in that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, deals almost entirely, putting aside Genesis 1, almost entirely with human dramas, human characters. And this difference might be a reflection of Judaism's insistence on humans' free will, okay? The ability of the human characters to determine where the story will go. People in the Bible are not pawns, well, people, according to Judaism, are not pawns of the gods or of God. Okay? They control their destiny with their own decisions and actions. Okay, so, and therefore, unlike pagan works of pagan religious works of the time, the Bible was a collection of stories about people, not the exploits of the God character. The New Testament shares some aspects of both other, the pagan religious works or mythologies, and the Bible and the Hebrew Bibles. It has some stories about people, but it is primarily a story about God. It's a biography of Jesus from birth through his exploits and relations and encounters and miracles, etc., to his death and resurrection. But I think the major difference between the later books, the New Testament and the Quran, and the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is that the Old Testament is not structured as a philosophy or theology lecture. Okay? The New Testament and the Quran deliver their message to the reader explicitly and directly. In the New Testament, the epistles are self-consciously theology lessons. But even in the Gospels, there are parts that deliver actual, fully formed theology lessons, delivered to the reader whole as written sermons, in which the author preaches to the reader the truth. Okay? The Quran, based on what I've read and heard about it, is even more so. The Hebrew Bible, for the most part, maybe the prophets, but no, even there. Okay, maybe the prophets are, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. I think those are more sermon-y. But in any case, most of the Bible, certainly the Torah and the early books, and the wisdom books, um, they do not deliver philosophical and theological lessons to its audience. Okay, let me rephrase that. The Bible certainly does deliver a philosophical and theological lesson to its audience, but it doesn't articulate a given lesson in the form of a philosophical or theological exhortation. Okay? Instead, it hides its message to you in these cool stories about interesting people. Okay? About Samson and Saul and David and Moses and Abraham and you know, the binding of Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and his brothers, etc. Okay? And I think there might be, you know, that there's a that it's a purposeful choice to deliver a philosophical message, but surreptitiously, because when someone lectures a certain philosophical message to you, okay, telling you you think X, but in fact it's Y, it primes you to ignore or resist the lesson because it's delivered as an exhortation. But when someone entertains you with a story, your intellectual defenses are down, or moral defenses are down. You absorb that philosophical message without noticing that you're being taught or indoctrinated. The author or the filmmaker is teaching you lessons, again, surreptitiously, as he or she is entertaining you. Okay, so the Hebrew Bible is completely literary. Okay, the story is front and center, and the sermon is something that the readers infer from the story. After they hear the story, they work out its meaning, its message, and that's the lesson they draw from it. Okay, the New Testament and the Quran are explicitly instructional. You know, with some sections delivered directly as a sermon, delivering an ethical or religious exhortation without any narrative, any literary narrative. But even in the parts that do offer a story, the sermon is pretty explicit. It's not hidden as it is in the Old Testament. Okay, unless there's another pressing question, I think we should say goodnight. And again, if anyone wants to register for that reading group, please email me. Thank you very much, and good night. Thanks.